The room looked dirty and unkept. It looked like an abandoned house that hadn't been used for years. The tiles on the walls were all cracked and chipped. There was garbage on the floor. It was pitch black everywhere, and against this background there was a chair lit by a bright spot of light, which looked very strange. Suddenly a guy appeared out of the darkness. His right arm was bandaged from shoulder to fingertips. It was obvious that bandaging had not been done for a long time, and most of the bandages were soaked with blood that it seemed that it would soon begin to drip on the floor. He leisurely approached the chair and got into a bright spot of light. The man who filmed all this on the camera offered him to sit down and start recording. The guy obediently sat down on a chair. He looked very tired and exhausted. Looking completely detached, looked somewhere in the distance and patiently waited for the shooting to begin. The man behind the scenes finished with all the settings and gave the command that everything is ready and can begin. The guy looked at the camera confused and did not know where to start his monologue. He frowned, trying to find the right words, because now a lot of people, just like him, were in this shelter, in this subway. He tried to start a conversation, remembering the families of all the people who were forced to be here now, and he hesitated half a word. His eyes flashed with all the pain and hopelessness of the situation in which many people found themselves. He looked uncomprehendingly at the camera and asked how important and obligatory this recording was, because judging by the expression on his face, it did not give him any pleasure, but rather pissed him off and annoyed him. The guy looked in front of him. The floor of the room was strewn with garbage, which looked very ugly. A few meters away from him stood people lined up in a row so that only their silhouettes were visible, and the man who filmed it on the camera confidently said that everything they are recording is very important, as very valuable information for posterity, because none of those present in the room did not know what awaits them in the near future. The man from the darkness, saying every word loudly, opening his mouth wide for some reason, tried to assure the boy that it was important to write down as much information as possible about who they were and at what cost they had managed to survive. The guy sat with his head down and tensely thought. Drops of sweat slowly rolled down his face. He wanted to say a lot, but the thoughts were confused in his head, turning into a mess, and he tried with all his might to concentrate. He was angry at himself, mentally calling himself a mumbler and a sissy, but gathering all his will in a fist. The guy made a sound like a lion's roar and exhaled and began. After saying hello and introducing himself as Seung Ho, he said he lives in Korea and is currently on a search for his relatives with his friends and associates. Unsure of how long they will be able to make the video, he simply asked those who cared to follow them to make sure their lives are not threatened. Seung Ho spoke and his voice became harder and harder, ringing like steel. He asked them not to forget about him and his friends. If something goes wrong and they cannot achieve the desired result, and it was no longer the timid boy who hesitantly entered this room. In front of the camera stood a real warrior. It was a clear, sunny day. The stadium was flooded with rays of sunlight. The game was in full swing on the field. The baseball fans were chanting loudly, worrying each for his team. Some believed that undoubtedly the winners will be the third class. Others respectively cheered for their own, believing that the fourth class are the best, and each of them was right. Baseball player on the field felt very confident. From the outside it seemed that he does it all with such ease, even especially not straining. Here as the ball flies and he clear swing of the bat repels it, sending it into the air. The ball flies up and flies very high, turning into a small, barely visible dot in the rays of bright light. The stands freeze in anticipation. That's the home run. The third-grade bleachers erupted in a victory cry. It was a very beautiful and professional combination that doesn't happen very often. So the guy who hit that shot was a hero. The guys in the stands started hugging each other, anticipating a quick victory over the fourth grade, because there was only one round left and finally everything would be over and this victory would free them from cleaning toilets. So they proudly shouted the name of their hero, calling Jang Daeju a man of one shot and the best of D in school. Their rivals were strongly disagree with this, because in the winning team there were guys from the basketball team and they thought that it was not fair. But still there were some desperate people in the stands, such as this lonely girl who, despite everything, still believed in the victory of the fourth grade and supported her players with all her might, shouting encouraging slogans. The guy sitting in the stands silently, with interest, watched the game. He was not shouting and chanting, as others did, so it was very difficult to understand what team he was rooting for. Looking at him gave the impression that he was thinking about something of his own, sadly rubbing his shoulder. The young man sitting in front of Seung Ho, who was filming the game on his cell phone, turned around and asked him why he didn't play baseball, as he had also played baseball in high school. Seung Ho didn't answer his question, but silently massaged his shoulder, knowing full well that he would never tell the truth. With a sly squint of his eye and a fake smile, he tried to joke that he would have defeated his opponents in one fell swoop and the difference in the score would have been 100 points, so he just took pity on them. It was time for lunch, so it wouldn't hurt to be refreshed. The sub-glass on the table was filled with delicious and varied food, which beckoned, emitting tantalizing aromas and with all its appearance wishing a pleasant appetite. The school cafeteria was filled to capacity with students who were divided into separate groups and were having a leisurely lunch while chatting with each other. At one of these tables, Seung Ho was sitting at a table and slowly chewing his food while listening to his friend who was sitting across the table and bragging about the fact that he had filmed a top report that needed to be uploaded to the network. Not knowing what to say to such a pestering friend, Seung Ho pretended to chew his food carefully, but at this moment he was thinking up a plausible version of his departure from the sport. Seung Ho said that he was very lazy and couldn't even get up in the morning because it was so hard for him, and in sports discipline is very important. To which his friend concluded that sports are for talented people like Jang Dae-ju. The plastic bottle flying with a whistle in the air was like a rocket projectile, which cutting through space, emitting the rumble of a flying rocket, inexorably approaching its target. After reaching the intended target and hitting the bullseye, the bottle made a loud rumble and collapsed to the floor, along with the defeated victim, who was Seung Ho, who could not hold on to the chair. He began to slowly fall backwards, waving his hands in the air, as if trying to grasp something and making strange noises. His friend, who was sitting across from him, opened his mouth wide in surprise and only had time to call his name. But he was numb as if from what was happening and only watched as Seung Ho's feet flashed in the air. Then the slaps flew in a completely different direction and he fell to the floor with a thud, and the tray of food that he had snagged when he fell covered him. Seung Ho's friend was very indignant that someone had dared to throw a bottle, because it was at least dangerous, and turning around, he saw a very angry and belligerent Han Seo-jin, who stood there frowning, showing that it was best not to mess with her. He was very surprised that such a fragile-looking girl could do such a thing. In a second, this fury was standing in front of Seung Ho and shouted at the whole dining room that she had been given a scolding for not being on duty yesterday because of him. But she was at the competition and had asked Seung Ho to do it. But he wouldn't listen to her and rudely called her a fool and said that he didn't have to be on duty for her and that she shouldn't dare to throw anything at him ever again. Seung Ho's friend, who was dumbfounded by what was happening, sat silently with his eyes wide open. For the first time he was present at such a fight, so he was afraid to even breathe, so as not to be seen. The girl's fist flew just a few centimeters from Seung Ho's face and silenced him. He froze in surprise, not really understanding what was happening. His face was a mask of surprise and his mouth opened spontaneously. Remaining in the same tense state, he remained silent, relieved that Han Seo-jin had missed, and ignored her indignation at his calling her a fool. Seo-jin jumped behind Seung Ho and wrapped her arm around the back of his neck and gave him a chokehold, loudly threatening that if he ever called her a fool again, he wouldn't live and she would help him. Seung Ho, feeling like he was about to suffocate, said loudly that he was wrong, and the other kids in the school cafeteria, who were in the cafeteria at the time, dropped their food and watched curiously, betting on how it would end up. Seung Ho's friend and another rotund man were whispering about what was going on the sidelines, watching Han Seo-jin, who was a winner in Muay Thai competitions and also had a belt in mixed martial arts. They were amazed at how two such different people could be friends since childhood. Seo-jin didn't let go of her grip for a second. Now she wrapped her hand around Seung Ho's back and twisted it harder and harder. He couldn't hold back the pain and opened his mouth wide and shouted loudly at the entire cafeteria, crying out for him to let go. Han Seo-jin let go of him and easily pushed him forward. Taking a step forward, he didn't notice and caught the table leg with all his might, hurting his leg in the process. The table shook and began to slowly serve, and with it the trays with food, splashing and staining everything in its path. Food flew in different directions. Seung Ho had no chance of getting away with it. He was sitting with his hands on the floor. Empty upturned trays and a pile of spoiled food were lying around him, and all his clothes were stained with small remnants of food, which fell on him as the trays fell, and he was literally boiling with anger. Han Seo-jin and Seung Ho's friend, who even at this moment was still using his cell phone and filming everything, thought it was very funny and entertaining, and Seung Ho was pathetic and should be filmed. It was evening. The city was plunged into darkness, but it was almost invisible, because the skyscrapers glittered and shimmered with bright signs and billboards, illuminating everything around them so that it was visible no worse than in the daytime. against the backdrop of grave crosses. Zombies were struck one after another at a rapid rate, their heads flying off to the side just like soccer balls, splattering blood all around. Seung Ho was completely immersed in the computer game, putting all of his anger towards Han Seo-jin into killing these scum. He was very offended that she was making fun of him in public. He was even 100% sure that in his past life, they were his worst enemies. But in the meantime, he calmed his nerves by killing these ghouls with precision. His faithful friend followed him around, never leaving his phone for a second. Sometimes it seemed that he was even filming in his sleep. Kyung-soo suggested Seung Ho to keep him company and play together. He thought that Seung Ho was the god of VR games and always wondered how he could get to the highest level without suffering even the slightest damage. Kyung-soo was sure that by streaming, they could make a lot of money. After listening carefully to Kyung-soo's suggestion and without taking his eyes off the game for a moment, Seung Ho became very excited. He had long wanted to earn money on his own so that he wouldn't have to ask his mom for money, but he didn't know how, and now he had doubts that it was really possible to earn money from streaming. Seeing how Seung Ho is on fire, his friend hastened to assure him that he does not have to do anything. His main task is just to play well, and everything else he takes on himself, calling himself the most brilliant producer of this planet. But Seung Ho somehow doubted that Kyung-soo's channel had a good rating and that there would be at least 100 subscribers, so he directly told his friend about it. And Kyung-soo was very offended and angry at such statements and firmly asked Seung Ho not to say what he didn't know at all. A victory march played on the screen and a computer voice announced that the game was over and Seung Ho was the perfect soldier who had scored the maximum number of points. Kyung-soo immediately forgot about all the grudges and marveled at his friend's victory, who had broken his previous record this time. Kyung-soo started hugging Seung Ho like a child, calling him a treasure, and was surprised that he hadn't noticed it before. But now he was going to use him and make a lot of money on YouTube. Seung Ho pulled out of the crazy man's clutches as fast as he could, shouting loudly that he hadn't given his consent yet. But then he stopped talking and stared at one point without blinking, his eyes maximally rounded, as if he saw a monster not in the game, but right in front of him. He didn't understand, but a strange feeling came over him from head to toe. He looked at the guys playing a computer game with excitement. One of them was just playing and voicing everything emotionally, but the other one felt Seung Ho's piercing gaze on him and turned around and looked at him point blank. Seung Ho was horrified to see his face. It was dotted with purple veins, which were like cracks in the dry earth, and from the head like a burrow snakes crawled out of the snake, wrapped around his head and neck. But the most terrible thing was the eyes. They were like two huge saucers and shone like halogen headlights, emitting light from the holes where the pupils should be. Seung Ho was scared to death and started tugging on his friend's shoulder so that he would pay attention to this horrible guy and see what was wrong with his eyes and head, and especially what kind of snake was on his head. The guys in the computer room did not pay attention to Kyung-soo and Seung Ho, because the first guy lost and now the second was ready to fight. Kyung-soo, looking at it, did not understand what his friend was talking about snakes, thinking that Seung Ho just overplayed today, so he saw all sorts of evil. When Kyung-soo stopped to wait for Seung Ho, he waved his hand and loudly asked him to hurry up because he was hungry. Seung Ho stopped for a second and looked at that guy again, but he looked like a normal person and decided that he was just imagining it and headed towards the exit. After catching up with Kyung-soo at the door, Seung Ho pretended to be angry that his friend hadn't waited for him, but he told him to stop daydreaming. Leaving the gambling hall, he did not see how intently the guy who had scared him so much was looking at him, and it was really a very scary look that gave him a chill. After giving Seung Ho a look, the stranger told his friend that he had to go to the bathroom, and after listening to his friend's boorish jokes, he went to the bathroom. As he walked down the stairs to the floor below, he saw the sign and opened the door to the restroom. Having done all his business, he went to the wash basin and turned on the water and stared at the mirror in front of him. The reflection in the mirror had a very painful look. The skin of his face had an earthy color. The whites of his eyes were inflamed and had a red tint because of burst capillaries, and sweat was dripping down his face in small drops. He looked at himself and wondered why that guy was looking at him so intently. Suddenly his eyes turned even redder and a foreign object started to move under the skin on his cheek. He looked in the mirror and couldn't understand what was happening to his face, so he was very scared. He was panic-stricken by what he saw. His eyes were puffed up and seemed to be about to burst or fall out of their sockets. Something foreign was moving on both cheeks, touching his neck as well, causing a hell of pain with every movement, and blood was spurting out of his nose in a small fountain, staining his clothes. In a minute he was in hell of pain, screaming loudly and feeling the lack of oxygen. He pulled the collar of his shirt with force, scratching himself bloody, trying to ease his condition. But what was inside him slowly but surely looked for a way out, tearing his mouth and spurting blood from the wounds. His face was distorted beyond recognition. One eye was a bloody mass of blood falling out of its orbit and swollen so that it seemed about to burst, and his neck had grown to gigantic proportions and was living a life of its own, twitching strangely in different directions. It used razor-sharp fangs to free its way, thus turning the head of its victim into a shapeless piece of meat. Intensely pushing with its short legs, it was slowly emerging from the body of the unfortunate guy. Having finally broken free, it plopped to the floor with a disgusting sound, being an incomprehensible substance of dark blue color all dotted with deep holes, reminiscent of the craters of a volcano, from which in a chaotic order protruded either fangs or horns, sharp as a samurai blade. Complemented all this ugliness of the lower part of the body, which was dotted with numerous short legs, which were covered with slime and blood. Standing still, the creature seemed to be admiring the breathless body of the guy, which was mutilated lying on the floor with an eye open, from which a strange, barely noticeable glow emanated. The monster slowly crawled across the floor of the toilet, often using its clumsy legs, which were bloody, and so the monster was followed by a long, continuous trail of blood. When it reached the wall, it climbed up it with the same ease, going higher and higher to the ceiling, from which the wall was divided into two parts by a bloody strip. Not waiting for his friend at the computer machines, the guy went in search of him. Reaching the toilet, he opened the door and loudly called him, resenting that his friend is so long and it would be time to go home. Taking a step forward, he entered the room and was petrified. His friend Yunho was lying on the floor in a huge pool of blood, which flowed from his head. The guy was confused and just stood there, not knowing what to do. After the first shock, he rushed to Hyunwoo, still hoping that he could help him. He wanted to know what happened in the bathroom, but crouched over his friend's body, he realized that there was nothing he could do to help him. Hyunwoo's skull was pierced by an unknown object, from which a stream of blood flowed. Panic gripped the guy. Trembling hands, he took out his phone and could not figure out where he should call, the police or the emergency service. From excitement and fear, he got chills and shook even more. Cold sweat dripped down his face and mixed with tears that ran down his cheeks spontaneously. His mouth twisted in horror and fear, but then he froze when he heard some foreign sound. Listening to the silence, he noticed with his side vision that a large blob of unknown slime-like slime flew past him. Slowly raising his head up, he was horrified to see something disgusting, which was hanging on the ventilation net, securely clinging to it with short, ugly legs. It was from them and dripped this disgusting, sticky slime. From the holes craters, where there were horned submarines, began to stick out long tentacles, which increased with each second stretched to the floor. The guy screamed as much as he could, not understanding what it is. Meanwhile, the tentacles were coming closer and closer to him. The guy wanted to run away, but stood still and as if mesmerized by what was happening, without stopping to scream. It was as if he was hypnotized and he stomped in one place. His legs became cotton and moved slower and slower. It seemed to him that he was screaming very loudly and now someone would come to his aid. But the wriggling paws came very close to his face and froze, but immediately with a frantic acceleration stabbed into his eye and mouth, which was wide open from the scream. The vile creature was trying with all its might to penetrate into his body and take possession of the guy's body, but he was trying with all his might to resist it. The forces were clearly not equal, and from this the vile creature was furious and thrashing around inside the body like a ball, making disgusting sounds. Finally, the monster managed to get the upper hand in this fight. It completely mastered the body and mind of the unfortunate and he began cleaning the toilet as if nothing had happened, washing the blood with a mop, thus removing all the evidence. After he finished cleaning the floor and walls of blood, the monster guy dragged Hyunwoo's mutilated body into the closet, hoping that it wouldn't be discovered soon, and threw the bloody mop into the closet. After closing the closet door, he stood by it for a while, holding it with his hand that was stained with blood, and after making sure that Hyunwoo was really dead, he headed for the exit. He looked like an ordinary man who was no different from the others, and only by looking at him directly in the eyes was there something inexplicably repulsive and suspicious. Coming out of the bathroom, he answered the phone to his mother, who was worried, and cheerfully assured her that he had already eaten dinner and was on his way home, swearing that he was not at the computer club. After closing the bathroom door behind him, the room was plunged into silence and semi-darkness, and even a casual visitor who entered here would hardly have guessed what monstrous and terrible events had taken place here just a few minutes ago. It was morning. The sunlight illuminated the windows of the apartment buildings that were lined up like twins. The city was slowly waking up and the streets were filled with the rumble of cars coming and going in different directions. In one of these houses, the mother was hurrying Seung Ho so that he would not be late for school. Seung Ho was still unclothed and only now could see that his shoulder was covered with scars of different sizes and lengths, but they were so many and intertwined with each other like a tangle of rattlesnakes, and the skin near some of them looked painfully inflamed, so it was clear why he kept rubbing his shoulder. His mother kept pushing and hurrying Seung Ho, and he stood near the mirror and put on a t-shirt and assured her that everything was fine and he was ready. Seung Ho was always late for school and his mother didn't know how to deal with it. She gave him an example of his sister who was never late and always left the house early, but at the same time his mother was worried about her son's health and suggested that he take time off from gym class. But Seung Ho, sitting on the floor and tying his shoelaces, hurriedly reassured her that he was fine. Without answering her son, his mother looked at him sadly, looking away from him with a look filled with anxiety and sadness, and thought about something of her own. Then quietly reminded Seung Ho that today was the anniversary of his father's death and with a tremor in her voice asked him not to stay late after class. Seung Ho lowered his head and remained silent. He remembered what day it was and it made him feel bitter and lousy, but he tried not to show his emotions. Pulling a smile on his face, he decided to make a joke and asked his mother if she would be late for work at the hospital. The city was bustling with its daily life and the most convenient mode of transportation, especially in the morning rush hour, was of course the subway. In Korea, the subway is like a separate art form. It can be both underground and above ground, where the tracks are laid right in the center of the city, on high stilts, between skyscrapers and office buildings, where getting to the desired place, you can admire the city views. The carriage was crowded and it was a common occurrence for this time of day, and in the back of the carriage, Seo-jin could be heard reprimanding Seung Ho for sending him a bunch of messages and he didn't even look at them, let alone reply. Seo-jin was very worried about her childhood friend, because yesterday it was her fault that he had gone home in wet clothes and might have caught a cold, and today she thought he didn't look well, so she worriedly touched his forehead to make sure he was okay and didn't have a fever. But Seung Ho felt uncomfortable at that moment and roughly pulled her away. The girl was offended by Seung Ho and turned away from him. The air was tense and the guy knew that his friend was quiet for a good reason. He knew her very well. And he was right. Seo-jin sharply turned in the opposite direction, walked away from Seung Ho. She did not understand why her friend ignored her. After all, she did not even hit him yesterday, and he sighed heavily, followed her, calming her and suggesting that she, as a professional athlete, just categorically forbidden to hit people. Seung Ho stopped abruptly and fell silent, his eyes rounded, filled with terror and fear. He stared unblinkingly at a single point as if he had seen a ghost there. Seung Ho grabbed Han So-jin's wrist tightly and squeezed it with force. The feeling that he had felt yesterday at the computer club when he saw that strange guy, and he started to look for the source of his restlessness, shifting his gaze from one face to another. Seo-jin, who was standing next to him, looked at him anxiously and didn't understand what was going on and why Seung Ho's face had changed so much. Finally, Seung Ho saw a bright red-haired guy in the crowd with giant tentacles sticking out of his head and wriggling in different directions as if dancing in the air. Seung Ho was very surprised that all the people around him in the carriage were very calm despite the horrible sight. The guy felt that Seung Ho had been staring at him for several minutes and turned around to look at him questioningly, while the tentacles sticking out of his head did not disappear. But there was a strange bright blue glow from one eye that added even more horror to his face. His face began to crack, his eyes turned into glowing saucers, and his tentacles became like snakes intertwining with each other and wrapped around his head and neck, all of which were eerily reminiscent of yesterday's story at the computer club. Seung Ho was startled by this déjà vu. He looked around and was surprised that no one but him noticed. His eyes were bloodshot and visibly bulging out of their sockets, his neck and cheeks were swollen, and the tip of a tentacle was sticking out of his mouth, and he began to choke. Leaning forward, he vomited blood, which kept pouring out of his mouth. A man standing near the boy, seeing how so much blood comes out of the schoolboy, very scared and loudly asked for help, thinking that the child is dying. Having torn and shredded everything that got in the way, the monster killer finally got out. The poor guy's head turned into a bloody mess from which blood flowed out in streams, even from the eyes of a continuous stream of bloody streams. It was a sight not for the faint of heart. The guy with a rumble fell face down on the floor without giving any signs of life, and around his body began to slowly form a pool of blood. The creature that came out of his body sat there and did not move. The body and paws of this rickets were completely in the blood, which flowed in large drops on the floor. People with fear looked at this something, which vomited schoolboy, but still everyone was curious about what it is. Strange, very similar to an egg. So they tried to get as close as possible to this object that would be better to examine it. Seung Ho and Han Seo-jin also saw it all with their own eyes, but stood aside. The girl was very frightened, because it was the first time she saw such a thing and was very worried about the injured guy, who lost a lot of blood, but still hoped that he would be okay. The vile creature stirred and came to life, rising on its many short legs, which were stained with someone else's blood and standing in one place, began to release a large number of bloody tentacles from the holes in its body, which rose up slowly swaying from side to side, as if hypnotizing its new victim. Seung Ho took her hand firmly, as if to let her know that he was there for her, hoping that he would be able to calm Han Seo-jin down a little. The girl was very frightened and trembling, looking hopefully at her friend and hoping to hear from him explanations about everything that was happening and how to get out of this situation. Seung Ho felt in his gut that what was happening in this carriage would not end well, so he decided that they had to leave, and they had to do so immediately, without delaying for a second. And then it's back to the circle. The guy who's choking on blood and a monster egg comes out of him. The breathless body of a schoolboy in a pool of blood and a monster killer next to the corpse. Curious passengers who are very interested in what it is and a monster looking for a new victim. And a completely unexpected turn of events when the man standing next to the guy's body bends in half and starts vomiting blood, and a minute later a completely identical killer egg crawls out of him. And now a girl nearby, in terrible agony, has vomited the same thing. Panic gripped the people in the car. They could not understand how such a monstrosity could be in a human body. And meanwhile the monster killers became more and more. And then it began what no one expected. The vile creature spotted its victim and with a precise sharp shot of tentacles tried to penetrate him. And it succeeded, because the tentacle hit the target and tried to get deeper through the mouth. The man tried desperately to resist, but it was useless. The monster egg was already deep in his body. The other people were watching with horrified screams, but no one rushed to help the poor man. People rushed to scatter, finally realizing the danger of what was happening and the principle of action of this monster. As the panic began to build up, Seung Ho was caught in the middle of it, getting punched in the jaw by a guy running by. He lost his balance and started to fall backwards. Han Seo-jin, who was running ahead, looked back and saw Seung Ho falling, but missed the tentacle slowly approaching her, and she swiftly attacked her quickly and confidently, making her way deeper. From the surprise, Han Seo-jin only shrieked softly and did not make another sound. Seung Ho, with his face petrified with horror, could only call out his friend's name quietly, realizing the hopelessness of the situation. But in such a position, one must be very careful and cautious, and here Seung Ho almost missed the nasty tentacle that approached him. In a second, the abomination was already entering him through his mouth, and he tried desperately to stop it, his cheeks and throat swollen with tension, and tears streaming from his eyes. But this thing had inhuman strength and no one could stop it. Seung Ho could feel how vile this monster was moving inside him, but he could not do anything. He just quietly called out for help. He was lying exhausted on the floor, rolling his eyes, which were red from the capillaries. Seung Ho looked somewhere in the distance, not blinking at all, and tears were flowing from the corners of his eyes, and he dreamed of only one thing, that no one would save them now. In front of his eyes, bright, lettuce-colored figures clearly ran like in a matrix. And then he saw on the snow-white board that all those who remained in this car would die in 58 minutes and 45 seconds. And before him arose the huge eye of a dead man, with a monster egg inside. Seung Ho woke up as if from hibernation, not realizing whether it was a dream or a vision, but he clearly understood that he had to run away as soon as possible. Otherwise everyone in this carriage would die because of this blue creature, and there were no other options. Behind him, he heard the thin, trembling voice of Han Seo-jin, who was calling out to him. Seung Ho no longer had the slightest doubt that it was better to flee from this place and run away right now before panic set in. In the carriage was very noisy. A crowd of gawkers surrounded the body of a schoolboy near which stood an incomprehensible creature. Everyone tried to get closer to make better shots with this abomination. There were flashes flashing around. People shouting at each other were shooting video, and everyone was very interested in what it was that appeared from the human body. The smartest decided to Google it on the internet to finally understand the origin of this creature. The man who stood closest to the center of events sharply folded in half with difficulty holding in himself gagging, but it was not good for him and in a few minutes he was already vomiting a fountain of blood, and a second later he came out of it exactly the same substance as from the injured schoolboy and with a deafening slap fell into a pool of blood. People with open mouths looked at it frozen with horror, so did not immediately hear the heartbreaking scream of a girl from the other end of the car, who stood near the bloody man lying on the floor, and from his mouth protruded the paws of the monster killer, which apparently stuck in the throat of his victim. Panic began in the carriage. People with trembling hands dialed the emergency service on their phones. Someone tried to ask for help on the internet, but there was no connection, and from this people's panic was gaining more and more momentum. Finally, people began to realize the danger of what was happening and the crowd stopped filming and began to look for an opportunity to provide first aid to the injured, who were already 3, but no one knew how to do it. In the crowd there was a loud voice of a guy who tried to get through the crowd to the injured schoolboy. It was a fireman and he knew exactly how to give first aid to people. The passengers began to part aside, making way for him. Finally reaching the victim, he opened his eyelid, studied his pupil for a long time and concluded that the guy was more dead than alive. But still not losing hope, the rescuer knelt down in front of the body of the schoolboy and put his ear to his heart, very much believing that the guy was alive. But around was very noisy and he could not understand whether there was a heartbeat or not. The crowd breathed a sigh of relief, happy that such a professional as this fireman was among them. The rescuer meanwhile tried to organize the people, giving clear instructions on what to do. For starters, he ordered to move all the injured to one place and stay in their places while waiting for the medics. He was also very concerned about those creepy creatures, which he suggested to catch in bags, for the safety of people. Suddenly, a loud voice was heard in the crowd, which was categorically against anyone approaching these vile creatures, warning that they were very dangerous creatures that could attack at any second. People frantically began to twist their heads to find the source of the voice in the carriage, and when they found it, they looked at Seung Ho with fear and disbelief. Seung Ho was very nervous. He wanted to warn people about a very big threat. He tried to explain that these are very dangerous insects penetrating human bodies and should be kept as far away from them as possible. But the people present in the carriage did not take it seriously and began to take video of him, as if he was some kind of crazy. After Seung Ho's words, the firefighter got angry for some reason and started to tell Seung Ho that it's not a good time to joke around because the situation is very difficult, so there's no need to panic because people are already stressed out. Without speaking, the rescuer's side vision saw that in the carriage is happening something strange. Turning to look, he saw that the egg monster is firmly attached in an upright position to the passenger seats and began to inflate to a giant size, clearly preparing for another attack. And he was not mistaken. From the body of the blue creature with the sound of a speeding train, tentacles flew out and with a whistle flew into the depths of the car, just where there was a large concentration of people, and from the ugly body protruded in full combat readiness of the next, which was also ready to attack and looking for a victim. With a precise and unexpected hit, she deftly flew into the mouth of the guy rescuer and without stopping began to confidently clean up the deepest part of the body. The guy clearly began to lack air and he began to make strange noises. Gathering all his strength, he tried to resist this creature, but the forces were clearly not equal, and no matter how much he tried to pull the tentacle out of his mouth, it did not work at all and only a strange gurgling sound came out of his throat. The strength left the fireman with each passing minute, but he steadfastly held the rest of the tentacle, which did not have time to penetrate his body, still hoping that he can overcome this monster. From the tension and fatigue of the guy's face covered with small drops of sweat, which slowly dripped off his face. But then the tentacles froze, tensed, and then so suddenly and sharply jerked that the rest of it, without much effort, flew into the inside, rushing after him and the hand of the guy, which he held it. The hand almost to the elbow entered the throat, thus blocking the breath, and the guy in a panic began to scratch his throat with force, and the creature reached its goal, already comfortably settled inside the man. The crowd, panic-stricken and fearful at the sight of such a horror, rushed to scatter, creating a crush, but each of the fleeing very much wanted to leave the place as soon as possible. Seung Ho stood back and watched what was happening. He wasn't surprised because the chronology of events was happening with jewel-like precision like in his recent vision, so he knew exactly how it would end and had to act immediately. The tentacles were flying at breakneck speed all over the carriage. They whistled over our heads like jet rockets, crashing into each other. So many of them. People in the crowd in panic fell flat on the floor and they were immediately overtaken by these terrible tentacles. It seemed they crawled out of every crevice. They could not hide from them, could not escape. Having caught up with their victim, they without unnecessary movements and by any means to climb inside the person. Even the sturdiest and strongest looking men were unable to cope with these monster killers. No one and nothing was able to stop this lawlessness. Terrible panic seized people, especially women were hysterical, moving on the floor on all fours. Small runs, their shrieks and screams were everywhere. They tearfully begged others to pull these monsters out of their bodies. Someone in the crowd shouted for everyone to move back, and the maddened tentacles began to attack the windows of the car with inhuman strength, leaving the glass through holes and cracks, lifting the guy out of the crowd. The tentacles swung him like a flake and with a precise movement launched him like a baseball straight into the window, which could not withstand and shattered into small pieces. Having flown out of the car, the guy flew quite a long distance before he fell on the asphalt with force, not giving any signs of life, and on top of him fell shards of glass and tentacles, long as lianas in the jungle, dangled from the broken windows, slowly swaying from side to side. Han So-jin was standing on the sidelines. She was very scared. Tears were flowing from her eyes. She couldn't believe that this was happening to her in real life. She wished that this nightmare was just a dream. She stood with her back pressed firmly against the carriage door, so that no one could attack her from the back, concentrating on what was happening in front of her and did not notice the insidious creature that had spotted her and was slowly creeping up from the side. Realizing that she had a very easy prey in front of her, her tentacles tensed up and rushed forward with a whistling sound, anticipating an easy victory. Seung Ho flew toward her, wrapped his arms around Han Seo-jin's neck with both hands, and instantly reacted by jumping aside so that the tentacles flew over them just a few centimeters away. They fell to the floor with a loud bang, but they lay still not believing in such luck. They managed to dodge the entity and it was a very small victory. The abominable outgrowth flew past them and crashed with great force into the ceiling of the car, freezing in place as if looking for a victim who dared to escape from it. Seeing their object of attack at last, the tentacles tensed up to make another jump and this time to reach their target with precision. Seung Ho grabbed some debris with fury and prepared to fight, not taking his eyes off the monster for a second, because it was in his best interest to keep the situation under control. The evil tentacle was already flying straight towards Seung Ho at full speed. With a prolonged rumbling sound, it was coming closer and closer to its target. Seung Ho was ready for this encounter. He put a piece of broken shelf in front of him as a shield, and the mindless creature, clearly not expecting such a thing, crashed into the barrier with a crash. Throwing the tentacle aside, he pinned it to the floor with the net, which was very uncomfortable, as one handle fell off with a piece of metal during the collision. Then Seung Ho raised the handle like a dagger and resolved to end this thing once and for all. With all the hatred he could muster, he stabbed the weapon into the monster. A crunch sounded and fountains spurted from the wounds, while the tentacle froze and lay motionless. Seung Ho coughed. His shoulder was hurting so badly that he wanted to howl, so he tried to calm down and catch his breath. Seung Ho completely did not expect such a thing and jumped aside. The tentacle came to life and jumped on the floor, wriggling in different directions, completely furious and uncontrollable. The arms that had been thrust into her a short time ago flew out of her body and spun away like two propellers, splattering blood around them. The tentacles with great acceleration approached Seung Ho and began to coil around him like a boa constrictor. The guy was frightened and began to scream with all his might. He did not like that all his movements were now limited and he could not move an arm or a leg, and to die in his plans was not in his plans. Seung Ho tried to resist with all his might, but the noose around his neck was slowly tightening and he was beginning to choke, opening his mouth and desperately gulping for air. Han So-jin saw what was happening to her friend and wanted to help him, so she began to think nervously about what to do. Seung Ho had already given up. The lack of air was causing him to lose consciousness and his eyes began to close for some reason. He felt like it was the end and the tentacles were towering over his head in anticipation of finally being able to get into his body. As the tentacle approached Seung Ho's eye, it paused for a moment and froze. The pupils of the protagonist rounded and watched the tentacle carefully, but at some point he felt that he could breathe fully, and no one was restricting his movements. And only when he saw Han So-jin desperately stabbing the monster with homemade knives did he realize to whom he owed his life. As she stabbed her dagger over and over again, she couldn't stop for fear that the thing wouldn't die and would stick to her, so she decided to slice the monster as long as she had the strength. When she felt her strength deserting her, she just pressed the bastard to the passenger seat with her dagger and it hung there, spattering small drops of blood around her. Turning to her childhood friend, she anxiously asked how he was feeling and promised to protect him, offering to hide behind her. Her fear had somehow left her and she was very belligerent, her fists clenched, ready to attack. Seung Ho was very happy to see her in front of him. His neck was burning and the strangulation mark was clearly visible, but he looked at her with gratitude and couldn't look away. Han Seo-jin looked like a real warrior at this moment, ready for any fight. The tentacles chained to the seats began to smolder in a strange way, releasing puffs of smoke. It shrank considerably before my eyes and the puffs of smoke grew larger and denser. In a minute it shriveled and turned into a thin ribbon like an earthworm and then suddenly burst into flames. The schoolchildren watched this picture with bated breath, not really understanding why this was happening, but the sight was mesmerizing and brought some relief. Such, until recently, a formidable spider egg, at the mere sight of which the goosebumps ran along the skin, and legs shook with fear, now looked very worthless and pathetic, having turned into a gnarled, rotten morel, from which the dried-up paw speeches were sticking out. The wagon looked terrible, everywhere lying dead egg monsters and people in which these things managed to get into. The floor was covered with bloodstains, and those people who managed to survive, with fear huddled along the walls, still not believing that the danger is over and these things will not come back to life. Some people in search of shelter climbed high up to the ceiling, climbing on the railing. Someone just stood there covering himself with a suitcase. Looking around, the passengers saw that the worm-like creatures had disappeared, and the monsters had shriveled up and were lying dead. People sincerely rejoiced that they were able to stay alive, not yet fully believing their happiness. The train, which was going at full speed, suddenly slowed down, emitting squeaks and scrapes, and then stopped like a halt, and the stop was clearly not planned. People in the car, who were hanging on the handrails and had a bad grip, flew down with a whistle, landing painfully on the floor. Seung Ho and his girlfriend didn't hold on either, so they lost their balance and flew backwards. The train stopped. The bodies of people who would never get out of the car at the station they needed were lying everywhere in the car, but those who survived were not in a hurry to get out either. Han Seo-jin and Seung Ho were sitting on the floor, leaning on the seats, and they could hear loud noises coming from the street. And even though the train was stopped and they could get off, but for some reason neither of them moved, listening to what was going on outside. Looking out the broken window, Seung Ho saw something that did not bode well. The entire city was shrouded in smoke due to fires burning at various points. Columns of black, stinking smoke rising high up into the clouds. High in the sky, from a bird's eye view of the city, was watching a very strange object. It was not clear why it was in the sky and what functions it performs, but the city was in chaos and mayhem. Burning buildings were covered with bright flames that at any moment could spread to nearby buildings. Cars standing right in the middle of the road in columns of thick smoke. Black, metallic, shiny, almost disc, but only with a hole instead of the middle and without a small piece that would close the circle. And so it was like a bitten bagel, but iron. It floated in the sky without making any sound, but who and for what it was launched was not known. The whole sky above the city was strewn with these unknown objects, which silently floated in the sky, and then with speed, a stone fell down, and then exploded. Helicopters' rescue service in full alert tried to destroy these iron, but they were so many that it seemed that instead of one killed appeared 10 new ones. In the streets, people were running in different directions to escape from the incomprehensible creatures, which simply crawled out of the corroded cars in swarms. Disgusting creatures with inexplicable vigor ran on their dwarf, ugly legs and several times faster than a normal person could do it. Cars stood abandoned right in the middle of the road, people in a hurry to leave them, with loud cries to save their lives. From all sides were heard cries for help, some running in one direction, in a panic, turned around and just frozen with horror, as they fell into the traps of these monsters. The floor of the car was strewn with bodies. Most of them did not give signs of life and it was not clear whether they were alive or not. In the corner someone moaned long, everywhere lying shoes, cell phones, shriveled corpses of monsters, and it all looked very creepy. Seung Ho looked at the whole damn thing and thought that if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he wouldn't have believed in such nonsense. He didn't even realize who these insects really were and how to fight them properly. The flow of cars stopped. A huge traffic jam was formed. People with families got out of their cars and stared at the sky. Some hurriedly took out their cell phones and filmed what was happening. In the sky floated a lot of incomprehensible for people objects. They did not make any sound, had a very unusual shape and glistened in the sun with their black, polished sides. The crowd covered their palms from the sunlight, which blinded the eyes and prevented as much as possible to see the strange objects. The crowd of gawkers was lost in guessing what was going on. Everyone had their own assumptions. Some thought that it was filming a movie, and some had versions that there are preparations for some grand events, but still no one left, and continued their shooting of strange objects floating in the air. A passenger of a stopped cab half out of the window was looking at the sky with curiosity, at the same time loudly addressing the driver. He was anxiously wondering that there might be a war. But these objects did not look like warplanes, unless it was a novelty in armament. Without waiting for an answer, he returned to the car and was speechless at what he saw. The cab driver was sitting in an unnatural pose, with his head thrown back and tentacles sticking out of his wide-open mouth like an octopus. The passenger looked at the driver, who no longer gave signs of life, but only made gurgling sounds. His cheeks and neck began to increase in size, because of which the veins under the skin were very clearly visible, creating the illusion that the entire head is covered with cracks. The man could not understand what is in his mouth. Suddenly, the driver's mouth cracked and burst open, splattering everything around with small drops of blood. The tentacles tensed up, ready to attack. The more the victim was very close and without thinking for a second, dug into the body of the passenger. The car, which had been standing quietly on the road, suddenly began to sway from side to side. Huge bloodstains appeared on the windshield, which ran down the glass in streams, and the car stopped again on the spot. Some strange outgrowths appeared from the driver's side window, and people with horror began to pay attention to this car, not understanding what was happening in this strange cab. The driver's leg pressed the gas pedal in a death spasm and the car jerked on the spot, but then pushing the gas to the stop it went forward. Hearing the squeal of the wheels, a group of people peacefully talking near the gas station rushed to scatter, and the car did not slow down. The gas continued to carry forward. A second and the uncontrolled car flew into the gas station. A powerful explosion with a deafening force broke the silence. A bright glow illuminated all around for many kilometers. People in panic fled from the epicenter of the explosion, and from the sky on them fell shards of glass, pieces of concrete, burning objects and all sorts of other construction debris. Some gawkers did not have time to run away. The blast wave fell them on the asphalt and they sat motionless on the sidewalks, looking at the place where a second ago there was a gas station, and now there were no bricks left of it, only fire slowly devouring everything that remained. After recovering from the shock, people began to call the fire department, but there was no connection. They did not give up and stubbornly tried again and again, but all was useless. In the crowd, a little boy called for his mother. He pulled her hands, but she was like a zombie and did not react to her child. The baby clutched his little hands to her shirt and cried, but his mother did not hear him. The nasty insect was climbing out of her, blocking her breath, and from lack of oxygen she frantically scratched her throat, leaving bloody furrows from her nails in the hope of at least a little relief from her suffering. Eventually the egg-shaped monster came out and slumped to the pavement, covered in blood, with bloody clots still falling on top of it. A woman bleeding fell right there on the square. The bloody stain formed right under her body was growing in front of our eyes. A baby sat near her and cried, trying to rouse her. People around wanted to help this poor woman, but did not know how. Others just gawked, as in the circus, looking at the something that crawled out of the body of the victim. Looking around, people began to notice that the whole hordes of these vile creatures were moving around the city. They were everywhere, very cleverly jumping on their short legs over cars and looking for their next victim. Lined up in a row, they were like a well-trained army of soldiers, as if on command, took a fighting stance, and at the same moment, from the bodies of these freaks with incredible speed flew out dozens of tentacles, rushing forward to their targets. The crowd of curious people looked at it with interest. They did not realize the danger they were putting themselves in by staying where they were, instead of saving their lives. And it began. The tentacles of the monsters reached the people and without leaving them any chance, began to attack quickly and methodically, climbing into the bodies of the unfortunate. When the crowd finally realized what awaited them, they rushed in different directions, panicking and jumping on cars. People were very scared of what was happening on the streets, and each of them did not want to end their lives this way. So those fleeing, saving their own skin, ran almost over the heads of those who were less fortunate. For these creepy creatures were no obstacles. They appeared in an incomprehensible way in the cabin of cars. Although all the windows were closed tightly and already in the cabin of the car easily attacked their victims. Because of this, uncontrollable cars with a rumble crashed into each other, creating on the roads terrible traffic jams, which in this situation were not, by the way. The sidewalks became a very unsafe place. People were barely dodging cars that flew in at full speed and without even slowing down crashed into huge glass storefronts, showering everything around them with glass shards. unidentified black objects, which people just a few hours ago filmed with such admiration, were circling over the city. They were so many that it seemed that they would cover the whole sky, and then suddenly for everyone, these seemingly harmless choppers spontaneously began to fall, while exploding, hitting any building. The sounds of explosions became more and more frequent, and now the city was covered with black clouds of smoke stretching from burning buildings. Seung Ho stood at the broken window and was pained to see what his city, which had been so beautiful in the morning, was turning into. A subway train stopped in the middle of the rails, wrecked cars, people lying on the road in bloody puddles, heartbreaking cries for help, an overturned bus, the interior of which is all red from traces of blood, and hundreds of egg-like creatures running here and there, which overtake the people who have already pissed people, easily take over their bodies, leaving them no chance. This is how the city looked after a few hours. In the train car, people who managed to survive covered a new wave of panic. They looked in horror at what their city is turning into, realizing that they are now in the safest place, but also well aware that there will be no one to save them in an emergency. People looked around the car, on the floor of which there were a large number of people. It was not very clear whether they were alive or not. Perhaps some of them needed immediate help, but the connection did not work, so to call the rescuers was simply not possible. But just to watch what was happening was also not right, and people began to call for action on their own. But not everyone agreed with such an initiative, and scandals began to break out around. The situation was getting heated. The man as a madman yelled at the girl, who simply expressed her opinion, and from this instantly became a boor and ill-mannered youth. So they did not hesitate to express themselves and talked in raised tones, and each of them thought that his opinion is the most correct, and with a foam at the mouth proved it to his interlocutor. Han Seo-jin and Seung Ho stood aside. They knew that this was not the right time for such arguments and discussions, but how could they explain it to adults who were self-sufficient and who were pissed off by their behavior? Unexpectedly, Seung Ho saw a picture that appeared in front of his eyes again, where the numbers 37 minutes and 42 seconds and the inscription that everyone who stays in this car will die. Seung Ho was startled to realize that the numbers on the scoreboard were getting smaller, but he couldn't decipher what it meant, what it was about, and what strange visions he was experiencing. Maybe he should take advantage of them. He remembered how he had once tried to warn people about the danger, but it was not clear how he knew enough about it to tell them in such detail. But still, something was bothering him, because he clearly remembered that in his visions, he had died, but it still hadn't happened. Then maybe it was a delusion. After weighing it all over again, he finally came to the conclusion that it was all his fantasies, or maybe even a sick imagination. He had never seen the future in his life, so why should he have this ability now? Han Seo-jin's voice brought him out of his stupor. His friend was worried about her parents, but she couldn't reach them, so she wanted Seung Ho to try calling his mom, but there was no connection and he couldn't get through. He wondered how his mom and sister were coping in the monster-infested city. Seung Ho really didn't know how he could help them now, but just in case, he left a message in the family chat room about where he was. The dispute between the man and the girl was getting stronger and stronger. Someone was trying to educate someone, and someone was working on youthful maximalism, and other people's advice in this case was not interested at all. It had to be finished somehow, and so a young man slowly headed in their direction in the hope of settling everything. The guy approached the disputants and said in a quiet, kind voice that the most important thing at the moment is to decide what to do with all these people, and the rest of the problems can wait for now. In the same calm and confident step, he approached one of the bodies, completely without any signs of life, and crouched down for examination. The scandalous man immediately switched to the guy, believing that he takes a lot on himself and in general unknown who he is, but without getting a word in response, quieted down. Meanwhile, the stranger concluded that the monsters appeared in the bodies of people because they were infected. Suddenly the motionless body made a sound. The guy did not react to it at all, but continued to voice his guesses that it was just parasite spores living in other living organisms. He stated with 100% certainty that these vile creatures used the human body as an incubator to breed other members of this ghastly species. Eventually it became clear to everyone that the infection is not transmitted by airborne droplets, but only when these things get into the body, where they mutate and become even stronger and more resilient. So to rule out a second wave of infection is just silly. These monsters can return at any time. The boorish man again exploded with anger, thinking that the young man was creating panic on purpose and why he thought that everyone should listen to his opinion, as if he were some kind of expert in these matters. The guy took a few steps in his direction, stopped in front of him, looked straight into his eyes and calmly asked him to calm down. The man just skewed from his calmness, but he really stopped talking, seeing that everything was in order. The guy went on to say that he was a professor of biology and worked at Meng University. curiosity. He honestly admitted that infections were not his specialty, but still, he had the right to believe that he knew much more than all the people in the carriage. The man began to doubt that a guy of such a young age could be a professor, but he introduced himself as Kim Bom Young in case anyone wanted to check up on him. Agreeing with the professor, it was decided to move all the bodies to one place and close. So having made improvised medical masks, people started to robot. The bodies lay motionless. Some of them had their eyes closed. Some of them had their foreheads rolled back, but they were all cold to the touch, like corpses, which made it doubtful that they could be helped. But as soon as they began to be moved, the bodies began to make horrible noises that made them uncomfortable. People carried the bodies, as the professor said, but at the same time they were afraid of the fact that these bodies were infected. So how could they touch them? And there were many more of them than it seemed at first. The schoolchildren sat on the sidelines and just watched the adults work. But at some point Han So-jin couldn't stand it and rushed to their aid, even though no one asked for it. Seung Ho tried to stop her and shouted after her, but she was already far away and didn't hear him as she vigorously went about her work. Seung Ho was alone and thinking about these bodies that had already been visited by the killer monsters, and he realized that it was very dangerous. So why didn't the adults understand it? Paying attention to the next body, he again clearly saw the tentacles circling above his head. It was clear that it was no longer a man but a mutant insect and should be kept as far away from him as possible. The numbers 33 minutes and 18 seconds flashed again, and Seung Ho wanted to find out what it meant. Finally, the red-haired guy who started the whole thing was lying on the floor and making noises. The passengers crowded around him, not knowing what to do with him, and Han So-jin, who was standing closest to him, suggested that they move him too. They couldn't just leave him here. Seung Ho saw his friend approaching the guy and shouted for her to drop the body immediately and move away from him as soon as possible, because her life depended on it. Seung Ho suggested about the guy's body, thinking that he was a mutant who was very dangerous. But Han So-jin didn't even want to listen to him, calling it nonsense. She asked him to get up and help. Furious at Seung Ho's heartlessness and indifference, she called him crazy and wanted to shame him for his behavior, but for some reason she stopped talking. There was that strange sound in the carriage again. Everyone fell silent and a hush hung in the air. Han So-jin looked around and saw a girl sitting on the floor in front of her with her face frozen in horror and her eyes bulging. She was pointing her index finger at her and trying to say something, but for some reason she was stammering in excitement and finally pulled herself together and with great difficulty was able to warn her that So-jin had something terrible on her hands. Han So-jin turned around to see what had happened and saw the body of a guy in her arms, whose head seemed to have a life of its own. His eyes were filled with a blue glow, and his mouth was once again filled with a creepy creature whose legs were sticking out in different directions, forcefully pushing Han So-jin's body away from her with a squeal. She jumped aside, but the sound coming from that mutant only grew stronger. The torso for a few minutes lay motionless with its face in the floor and did not even make any sounds, but then it sharply raised its head and bent its neck in an unnatural position. Eyes flashed, illuminating everything around like two headlights. From such a sight, many of those present had frost running down their skin, but everyone stood and was even afraid to move, fearfully waiting for what would happen next. No one in the crowd thought that they should run before it was too late, because the second time might be bad luck, but instead they were discussing the way the neck was twisted and what was coming out of the monster's head. The mutant lowered his head to the floor and froze. His eyes flashed even brighter, his paws protruding from his cheeks tensed like antennae, and his jaw moved forward for some reason, revealing shark-like teeth. Then on the neck grew another head, a moment later another one, and between these two looked out this monster with glowing eyes, and from under them streams of blood flowing. Tentacles have already increased in size a little and frighteningly move like small snakes. My neck began to twist spontaneously in different directions with a crunch, tearing veins and vessels, from which blood immediately began to spray in all directions. Then the head began to slowly separate from the body. The mutant often groped ugly paws, which were clearly hard to pull such a load, but he stubbornly moved forward, pulling the spine centimeter by centimeter from the breathless body. It looked just disgusting. A head with a huge mouth with razor-sharp fangs sticking out of it, and blood dripping from the corners of the mouth. Empty, soulless, glowing eyes staring at nothing, and at the same time looking into the soul of everyone present. A bloody piece of neck with open veins and arteries, from which blood gushed in all directions, and the spine, slowly stretching behind the head, leaving a bloody trail behind it, was more like the tail of primitive reptiles. Only after that people fussed, and from the horror of what they saw they did not know where to run. They ran chaotically around the carriage, bumping into each other. None of them knew how to stop it, and so, when someone suggested to just run to the next carriage, everyone rushed there without a second thought. Han So-jin was sitting on the floor and was almost squeezed into the seat because of her fear, while a killer head with sucker tentacles sticking out of its mouth was slowly crawling towards her, and she wanted to call for help, but she couldn't say a word, so she just watched the creature. She repeated to herself like a spell to keep this abomination away from her, and tears flowed from her eyes with helplessness. Suddenly, the slowly creeping creeper stretched like a string and pushed off the floor and flew towards the girl with an arrow, developing a decent speed in flight. It was quickly approaching the frightened So-jin. Seung Ho saw all this and was very scared for her. He quickly began to think of ways to help his friend. Although Han So-jin was scared to death, she caught the creature in flight and held it firmly by the ears in front of her, but she realized that she wouldn't be able to hold on for long, because the creature had incredible strength and power, and she didn't like it. The monster's jaws slid apart like a sliding gate, and a proboscis-like thing emerged from its mouth, with small tendrils sticking out of it, which were moving and reaching for Seo-jin's face. Seung Ho was already rushing to her aid, thinking that he couldn't deal with this thing, so he had to find a weapon and was nervously turning his head, hoping to find something. His gaze fell on a bag lying on the floor with a baseball bat sticking out of it, and not believing his luck, he grabbed it and rushed over to Han Seo-jin. The girl fought with all her strength, which with each passing minute left her from such tension. Her face was covered with small drops of sweat and the distance between her and the ugly head was shrinking rapidly, but she did not give up, continuing to fight. The sucker's trunk grew larger and larger with each passing minute, thus shortening the distance between the mutant and the unfortunate girl. Drooling, mixed with slime rolled down and large drops fell to the floor, making a disgusting sound. In the end, the sucker trunk reached Han So-jin's face and tried to launch its small tentacles into her mouth, but she clenched her teeth tightly and dodged as best she could, but she knew she wouldn't be able to hold on for long, and then she was dead. But when she saw a baseball bat in the air right above her and a loud order from Seung Ho to duck, she did as Seung Ho asked her. It was a very powerful and magnificent blow. Seung Ho hit the bullseye. With a noise and whistling, the unsuspecting mutant flew away in an unknown direction. Seung Ho was very angry. His face was filled with hatred and disgust. His teeth were clenched tightly, and he did not relax for a moment, knowing these creatures well. So he was waiting for the next attack. Han Seo-jin kept her gaze on her friend, who was so bold and daring that she had seen him for the first time and felt grateful to him for saving her. Flying to the other end of the car, the monster noisily crashed at full speed into the wall, finding the eye scanners of his opponent, who prevented him. The mutant was waiting for a convenient moment to suddenly attack. Pushing off the wall, the monster flew straight at Seung Ho, who had already prepared to fight and was holding the bat at the ready, gathering his strength to strike. He swung, putting everything into that blow just to destroy the bitch as quickly as possible, and with a loud shout he prepared himself. The flying monster was knocked down with one clear blow and collapsed to the floor, where it received another round of blows, splattering blood in all directions. Seung Ho was hitting without stopping. He hit with fury and was very afraid that this thing would survive, so he hit again and again. The mutant's head had turned into a bloody mess, and the nose and skull was shattered into small pieces, so the head looked like a deflated basketball. But the guy still did not stop. A sharp pain pierced Seung Ho's body and he was forced to stop. Gripping the bat in his other hand, he felt nothing, as if his arm was paralyzed. But at the same moment, his face twisted in pain. Seung Ho thought he couldn't bear the pain and clenched his teeth tightly so that he wouldn't shout at the whole car. His shoulder, having received a very serious load, was now so painful that Seung Ho felt like his arm would simply fall off from his torso. It was a hellish pain and he didn't know what to do to ease his condition, so he began to slowly massage his shoulder. Seung Ho was 100% sure that he had destroyed the mutant killer, so Han Seo-jin's hysterical shout of danger took him by surprise. Seung Ho heard heavy breathing and smelled the foul, stinking odor of decomposing blood, and with his side vision he saw that the disgusting abomination had flown very close to him and was circling around his head, ready to attack at any moment. And it did not have to wait long. Small and razor-sharp teeth, this beast bit into the guy's sore shoulder. Seung Ho did not expect this and howled in pain. It was heard as the bitten skin crunched and the shirt began to be covered with blood, and from the mouth of the creature splashed drops of blood. Biting down on his arm, the mutant unclenched its fangs, and at the same moment Seung Ho felt the small tentacles move to find the wound and actively began to search for a way to get inside his arm. At the same moment the spine of the creepy scum encircled the guy's neck, putting a sharp sting to his throat. The arm spontaneously rose up and swelled to an incredible size, inside it actively moving alien limbs, trying to get as deep as possible into the body of its victim. Mortal horror seized the young man. He felt with every cell of his body, as this disgusting creature is slowly taking over his body. In his head he had various thoughts that most of all in the world he would not want to die such a death, and he looked around in confusion, as if looking for help with his eyes. But he knew perfectly well that he could not expect help from anywhere. The silence was broken by a deafening explosion. A huge amount of blood splattered in different directions, flooding everything around, and fragments of tentacles and offshoots flew into the air, spinning in the air. They looked like giant earthworms. Seung Ho looked up and saw the professor standing above him, holding a long piece of rebar in his hands, and raising it high above his head. He brought it down with all his might, trying to hit the monster. The rebar, like a sharp spear, hit its target, piercing the head from cheek to cheek. The mutant let out a terrible howl and fell silent. The armature was embedded in the floor of the car, and on it, like a scarecrow in a vegetable garden, hung the head of the defeated monster, making unintelligible sounds. And on the floor, large drops of blood fell, forming a bloody puddle. The professor's leg lifted high, and with an effort he sank to the floor. Stepping on the mutant, he transferred the full weight of his body to that foot, even jumping slightly, and the killer head crunched under the sole, splattering blood on his shoe. Without removing his shoe from the monster, the professor jerked and pulled the spear out of the dead mutant. Behind him, Han Seo-jin was sitting on the floor, watching carefully, and Seung Ho was also beside him, bent over from the pain in his shoulder and pressed himself against the floor. Having crushed the vile organism and having made sure of its death, the professor turned to the crowd and said that it is necessary to stop panic and calmly reacting to these insects to try to destroy them, and for this purpose it is necessary to crush the heads, as these terrible individuals parasitize there. People in the carriage listened attentively to the professor, quieted down. They doubted their strength, but they had no other choice. Han Seo-jin boldly grabbed the fire extinguisher and looked at the crowd with determination and said that since they had survived, they had to catch and destroy these creatures, especially since there was no other way to escape. Acting on the clear instructions of the professor, people armed with what they could crowd-cornered mutants, and then caught and destroyed, thanks to the fact that the passengers are very united and helped each other. The elimination of crazy insects was very fast. Only Seung Ho, who was sitting on the sidelines, was not participating in the insect extermination. He was worried about the pain in his arm, and the size of his arm was still gigantic. Sitting on the floor, he was swinging from side to side like a pendulum, trying to relieve the pain. His shirt was half soaked with blood that was oozing from his wounded shoulder and dripping onto the floor, and a worried Han Seo-jin was sitting next to him, not knowing how to help him, stroking his back. Seung Ho's arm was living a life of its own, and in confirmation of that, the maggots that had gotten inside her arm were pulling it in different directions, causing Seung Ho to cry out in pain. Looking at his friend, he begged her to pull those creatures out. And then what he was afraid of began to happen. The maggots, trying to penetrate as deep as possible, blocked the breath, and Seung Ho, greedily gulping air, began to gasp for breath. Putting his hand to his neck, he clearly felt these creatures swarming inside him. Han Seo-jin was very scared for him and rushed to his aid, but she didn't know what to do in such a situation, so she just calmed down Seung Ho, telling him to breathe a little slower. The students were very scared, so they didn't even notice that a man stopped behind them, holding a well-sharpened knife, and after standing for a while, he walked towards them with a confident gait. After a second, someone's strong hands threw Seung Ho to the floor and pinned him to the floor. From such an unexpected fall, the guy hit his head hard on the floor and screamed. Han Seo-jin jumped aside and looked at the professor, who was sitting on Seung Ho, holding him tightly with both hands, and in his mouth he had a knife, which he held with his teeth. Looking at such a sight, she was scared for her friend and became hysterical. Screaming, she asked him to explain why he had a knife and what he was going to do to her friend. The professor had a knife in his mouth. He held the boy with his hands, turned to the girl and looked at her questioningly, as if asking how she imagines to get answers to her questions. After releasing his mouth, the professor hurried to calm Han Seo-jin down and tried to convince him that he just wanted to help and that he should do it immediately without wasting a minute, because if he didn't do it, Seung Ho would vomit insects and then there would be no help. He said that he had surgical tools and should get those maggots out of the guy's body as soon as possible before they infected him and reached his brain. Seung Ho also heard this conversation and was very frightened, not understanding how an operation could be performed under these circumstances to get these insects out of his body. The scientist realized that he didn't have enough equipment to perform the operation and was very worried about the threat of bleeding. But now the most important thing was to get rid of the infection. The man warned that it would be very painful and Seung Ho would have to be patient and be prepared for any outcome of the operation. Looking at the guy trembling with fear, the man saw how much he was afraid and decided not to deceive him and warned him that he did not have even basic painkillers, so he had to try very hard to endure the pain. Without wasting time, the professor began the operation, making an incision on the guy's arm. He tried to do it very carefully, but from the wound, immediately in different directions, blood spurted. Seung Ho screamed with such force that it seemed to be heard on the other side of the city. It wasn't just painful, it was a hellish pain.